The iron gates of the colonial estate groaned as Drex Hullowan stepped through, his signature tailored black suit a jagged shadow against the sun-drenched white pillars. The scent of fresh sawdust and wet primer wrapped around him, a sharp, clean sensation far removed from the cold steel and cigar smoke of his usual domain. He was here for one purpose, to reclaim the $50 million Tressa Hale had stolen and to ensure she never drew another breath. His dark eyes swept the chaotic interior, taking in the scaffolding and the framed children's drawings of stick figure families that adorned the walls instead of the fine art he expected. Here, surrounded by cans of white paint and the gentle hum of construction, the most feared man in the city felt oddly displaced. "We aren't taking any more applications today," called a weary, determined voice from atop a ladder. Drex's breath caught. That voice, steady and resonant, was the only one that had ever dared to speak back to him. His heart hammered against his ribs as a figure descended, white paint smudging her dark skin, a fierce look of protectiveness lighting up features that had fueled his rage for 2 years. Tressa Hale froze mid-step. A small boy named Knox perched beside her, his tiny hands clutching a lunchbox. The child looked up at Drex with curious eyes Drex recognized from a man he had buried years ago, completely oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in the room. "Tressa," Drex whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of a distant hammer. Time seemed suspended in the paint-scented air of the orphanage as the stolen millions on his bank statement suddenly transformed from a debt into a penance. The iron gates of the colonial estate didn't just groan, they shrieked against the pavement, a sound that mirrored the jagged edge of Drex Hullowan's patience. For 730 days, he had rehearsed this moment. He had envisioned Tressa Hale cowering in a marble villa, perhaps sipping vintage wine bought with the $50 million she had bled from his accounts. He expected to find a thief. He expected to find a traitor. Instead, as he stepped onto the gravel driveway, the air was thick not with the scent of expensive perfume, but with the raw, biting tang of sawdust and wet primer. Drex's polished black shoes, usually reserved for boardrooms and back-alley executions, crunched over discarded wood scraps and empty mortar bags. He looked up at the building, a stately colonial structure that was clearly in the middle of a violent rebirth. Scaffolding crawled up the white pillars like a spider's web, and fresh cans of white paint stood like silent sentinels near the entrance. There were no guards, no high-tech security systems, only the rhythmic, hollow thud of a hammer echoing from somewhere deep within the house. He reached inside his tailored jacket, his fingers grazing the cold, familiar weight of his weapon. The steel and shadows of his world felt heavy and clumsy in this sun-drenched space. He pushed past a hanging plastic sheet that acted as a makeshift door, his eyes scanning for the woman who had seen him at his weakest and then chosen to rob him blind. He found her in what should have been a grand foyer. Tressa wasn't wearing silk or diamonds. She was perched on a shaky wooden ladder, a simple tan apron tied over her clothes, her dark skin smudged with streaks of white ceiling paint. She was focused, her brush moving in steady, practiced strokes, oblivious to the predator who had finally breached her sanctuary. Around her, the walls were stripped of their former glory. In place of expensive tapestries, there were framed drawings, crude, colorful stick figure families and lopsided houses with bright yellow suns. It was a visual slap to the face. Drex stood rigid, his lips slightly parted in a rare display of disbelief. This wasn't a hideout, it was a construction site for something soft, something vulnerable. "I told the foreman we don't need more supplies until Tuesday," Tressa said, not looking down, her voice steady and melodious, a sound that hit Drex like a physical blow. "I'm not the foreman, Tressa," he rasped. The brush stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the house itself had held its breath. Tressa turned slowly, her expression shifting from focused calm to a look of fierce, weary protectiveness. As she looked down at the man who had come to destroy her, she didn't look like a thief caught in the act. She looked like a woman standing on holy ground. Tressa descended the ladder with a slow, deliberate grace, never taking her eyes off the man who represented the life she had fled. She stood her ground in her paint-speckled apron, her posture radiating a fierce protectiveness that acted as an invisible barrier between Drex and the rest of the house. Drex felt the heavy weight of the ledger in his hand, the paper trail of his stolen millions, but the cold satisfaction of the hunt was rapidly dissolving into a confusing sense of displacement. The standoff was shattered by the patter of small feet against the subflooring. A young boy, no more than 5 years old, emerged from behind a stack of lumber, clutching a blue lunchbox. He walked with a stumbling confidence directly toward the dark-suited stranger, his head tilting back to take in the fancy man. "Knox, stay back," Tressa warned, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't quite mask. But the boy didn't listen. He stopped just inches from Drex's polished shoes and looked up with wide, liquid brown eyes. Drex looked down, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He didn't see a stranger's child. He saw a ghost. The specific shape of the brow, the stubborn set of the jaw, it was a carbon copy of Elias Alder, a man Drex had personally erased years ago for a debt that now seemed trivial. Drex's hand, which had been resting near the weapon beneath his coat, went numb. He looked from the boy's innocent face to the framed drawings on the walls, the stick-figure families that Elias would never get to be a part of. The stolen millions weren't sitting in a Swiss bank account or being spent on luxury villas. They were being used to build a roof over the head of a child he had made an orphan. "Mama, is he a king?" Knox asked, his voice full of the pure curiosity that only a child could possess. The question pierced through Drex's carefully constructed defenses. He wasn't a king. He was the villain in this boy's story, and for the first time in his life, the power he wielded felt like a leaden weight. He looked at Tressa, seeing the traitor in a terrifyingly new light. She hadn't just stolen his money, she had stolen his right to be the only monster in the room. The debt was no longer about currency, it was about a bloodline he had tried to end, now thriving on his own dime. Drax remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the boy whose existence was a living indictment of his past. The silence in the foyer was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a hammer deeper in the house. Tressa took a step forward, gently nudging Knox toward a small table where a coloring book lay open. Once the boy was occupied, she turned back to Drex, her expression shifting from fear to a cold, hard pragmatism. She reached for a worn, leather-bound folder resting on a stack of drywall and thrust it toward his chest. Drex didn't move to take it at first, his eyes still tracing the familiar features of Elias Alder in the child's face. "You want your money back, Drex?" Tressa's voice was a low, jagged whisper that cut through his trance. "Then audit the books. Look at exactly where your stolen millions went." Drex finally took the ledger, his fingers feeling the grit of sawdust on the cover. He opened it, expecting to see offshore transfers or shell company names. Instead, his eyes met rows of meticulous handwritten entries. There were no yachts, no penthouses, and no diamonds. The columns were filled with the mundane and the vital: pediatric antibiotics, industrial-grade insulation, Montessori school books, and psychological counseling fees. His eyes scanned a page dated 6 months prior. $30,000, prosthetic leg for Maya, age 7. He remembered that name. Maya's father had been a driver for a rival family who had been caught in the crossfire of a territory dispute Drex had sanctioned. Every cent you're looking for is in these walls, in those medicine cabinets, and in the food that boy is eating, Tressa said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. I didn't take your money to start a new life. I took it to pay the debts you were too arrogant to realize you owed. Drex flipped through page after page of names he recognized, the children of the men he had ordered gone, the families left in the wake of his business decisions. The $50 million, a sum that had once represented pure power and leverage, now looked like something else entirely in the light of these entries. It looked like a drop of water in an ocean of blood. He looked back at the traitorous maid. She stood before him, smudged with white paint and weary to her bones, and for the first time in his life, Drex Hollowan didn't know how to settle the account. The weight of the ledger felt heavier than the weapon under his coat. It wasn't a record of theft, it was a road map of his own sins, and Tressa was the only one brave enough to try and fix the damage. Drex slammed the leather-bound ledger shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the unfinished foyer. The weight of the names inside, the children of his victims, anchored him to the spot, making his retreat impossible. He looked at Tressa, her chin tilted in a silent challenge, and then at the $50 million worth of drywall and hope surrounding him. He couldn't kill her here, not in front of the boy, and he couldn't walk away while his legacy was being laundered into a sanctuary. I'm not leaving the money in the hands of a thief, Drex rasped, though the words felt hollow even to him. If this is where my capital is buried, I'll be here to oversee the construction myself. Tressa's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through her armor, but she didn't back down. Fine. If you're staying, you're working. We don't have room for spectators in suits. By noon, the Mafia sovereign was a man transformed by necessity. Drex had shed his tailored black jacket, tossing it over a sawhorse, and rolled his white sleeves past his elbows. His silk tie was gone, replaced by the gritty reality of a colonial house being rebuilt from the inside out. Standing on a crate in the kitchen, he held a heavy sheet of plasterboard against the ceiling, his muscles, honed in high-end gyms and back-alley brawls, straining under the unfamiliar, steady weight of manual labor. His hands, which usually held the power of life and death, were now covered in the chalky white dust of gypsum. It was a different kind of blood money. Every time his arms began to shake, he looked down and saw Knox Alders sitting on the floor nearby, meticulously organizing a box of copper pipes as if they were the world's most precious toys. The boy's presence was a silent taskmaster, a constant reminder of the debt that couldn't be repaid with a bank transfer. Tressa moved around him with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing this alone for too long. She didn't offer him water or a kind word. She simply handed him a cordless drill, her fingers briefly brushing his paint-smudged skin. The contact was electric, a reminder of the 2 years of rage and longing that had led him to this moment. Keep it level, Drex, her voice softening just a fraction. If the foundation is crooked, the whole house falls. Drex gritted his teeth, the drill whining as he drove a screw into the joist. He was a man who had built an empire on fear, but as the sweat dripped into his eyes and the dust coated his lungs, he realized for the first time that building something meant to last was far harder than tearing it down. The sun began to dip behind the colonial pillars, casting long, skeletal shadows of the scaffolding across the dusty floorboards. Drex wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of a hand stained by primer and grit. His muscles, usually primed for the explosive violence of his world, throbbed with the dull, honest ache of a day spent in service to someone else's dream. The steel and shadow that had defined his existence for decades felt strangely brittle in the fading light of the orphanage. Tressa had moved to the back of the house to check on the plumbing, leaving Drex alone in the foyer with the boy. Knox was sitting on a pile of sanded planks, swinging his legs and watching Drex with the same unblinking intensity his father once had, though without the terror. The silence was thick, filled only with the settling of the old house and the distant hum of the evening insects. "Mr. Fancy Man?" Knox's voice was small but clear, slicing through Drex's internal audit of his own sins. Drex stopped his work on the baseboards, turning slowly. He didn't know how to talk to children. They were a foreign species in his world of calculated risks and cold executions. "It's Drex," he corrected, his voice raspy from the dust. Knox hopped off the wood and walked closer, stopping just outside the reach of the white paint cans. He tilted his head, his eyes searching Drex's face with a devastating lack of judgment. "Why do you look so sad, Drex? Did you lose something too?" The question hit Drex harder than any bullet ever had. It bypassed his armor, his reputation, and his $50 million, striking the hollow center of his chest. He looked at the boy, a child whose father he had taken, living in a house built by a woman he had intended to kill, and realized that the stolen money was the least of his losses. "I didn't lose anything, Knox," Drex finally managed, though the lie tasted like ash. "I'm just tired. My mama says when people look like you, it's because their hearts are under construction," Knox said matter-of-factly, gesturing to the scaffolding. "But we're almost done with this room. Maybe your heart will be finished soon, too." Drex stared at the boy, his jaw tightening as he felt a crack in his carefully constructed mask. He saw the kingdom of innocence Tressa had worked so hard to build, and for the first time, he understood that he wasn't just here to monitor an investment. He was the wreckage that needed to be cleared away. He turned back to the wall, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the drill, unable to meet the boy's piercing, hopeful eyes. The stillness of the evening was shattered by the low, guttural growl of a high-performance engine pulling into the gravel driveway. Drex didn't need to look through the unfinished window to know the sound. It was the roar of the world he had tried to leave at the gate. He stood up, the cordless drill feeling suddenly like a toy compared to the violence he knew was sitting in that car. Tressa appeared at the end of the hallway, her face pale, her eyes darting toward Knox, who was still humming to himself over his box of pipes. "Stay inside," Drex commanded, his voice returning to the cold, absolute authority of the Hanel organization's sovereign. He stepped out onto the porch just as the door of a sleek, charcoal-gray sedan swung open. Marco, Drex's second-in-command, stepped out. He looked like a jagged piece of glass in a garden, his eyes scanning the colonial pillars and the scaffolding with a mixture of confusion and contempt. He held a tablet in one hand, the screen glowing with the bank statements that had led them here. "We found the leak, boss," Marco said, his voice grating against the quiet air of the sanctuary. "The trackers put the funds right here. We're ready to move. The boys are 2 minutes out to scrub the site and take the girl's head for the insult." Drex felt the weight of the stolen millions shift again, not as a debt, but as a shield. He stepped down the stairs, placing his body between Marco and the front door where Tressa and the son of Elias Alder were hiding. He had spent years building a reputation as a man who never blinked, a man who viewed mercy as a fatal flaw. Now he had to use that very reputation to weave a lie that would save the people he had come to kill. "Stand down, Marco," Drex said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. "The money isn't gone. It's being moved through this property into a high-yield laundromat I'm setting up. The maid didn't steal it. She's my primary operative. This orphanage is the front for a new distribution hub that will make the Hanel organization untouchable." Marco hesitated, his brow furrowing as he looked at Drex's paint-smudged sleeves and the grit on his hands. "You're working the site yourself, boss? Since when do we do our own masonry?" "Since I decided the foundation needed to be airtight," Drex countered, his stare so intense it forced Marco to look away. Tell the men to turn around. If any of you set foot on this grass without my permission, you'll find out exactly how I treat trespassers. The girl is under my personal protection until the merger is complete." Marco nodded slowly, the habit of obedience outweighing his suspicion. As the sedan retreated back through the iron gates, Drex remained on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just declared war on his own empire to protect a house built on his victim's bones. He turned to see Tressa standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He had lied to his men, but as he looked at her, he realized he was finally starting to tell the truth to himself. The heavy iron gates had barely finished rattling from Marco's departure when the air was pierced by a sharp, splintering crack. It was a sound Drex knew instinctively, the sound of structural failure. He spun around just as a muffled cry erupted from the side of the house, where a secondary line of scaffolding reached toward the second-story eaves. One of the younger children, a girl named Maya, whom Drex had recognized from the ledger, had climbed onto the lower platform to reach a stray paintbrush. The wood, weakened by a day of heavy rains and the weight of stacked shingles, gave way. The metal supports groaned, buckling inward as the entire structure began a slow, terrifying tilt away from the stone wall. Drex didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk to his person or the strategic disadvantage of revealing his vulnerability. He sprinted across the gravel, his boots kicking up dust as he dived toward the collapsing frame. Tressa's scream echoed behind him, but he was already in the shadow of the falling steel. He reached the base just as the platform lurched. With a roar of effort that strained every muscle in his back, Drex caught the primary crossbar, his body acting as a human brace against the weight of the shifting metal. The rough iron bit into his palms, and a cascade of wet plaster and grit rained down on him, coating his hair and face in a chalky gray sludge. His white shirt, once a symbol of his untouchable status, tore at the shoulder as he shoved his weight upward to stabilize the collapse. "Jump!" he snarled through gritted teeth, the pressure in his chest feeling as though it would burst his ribs. Maya tumbled into the soft dirt just as Drex let go, rolling clear a split second before the remaining wood splintered into a heap of debris. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by Drex's ragged, heavy breathing. He stood up slowly, a far cry from the pristine Mafia Boss who had arrived that morning. He was covered in filth, a mixture of mud, white paint, and the dust of a crumbling past. Tressa reached Maya first, clutching the girl to her chest, but her eyes were fixed on Drex. She looked at the man who had built a life on breaking things, now standing amidst the wreckage of something he had chosen to hold together. As Knox ran over to hand Drex a damp rag, the boy didn't look at him with awe or fear. He looked at him as if he were just another man who had worked hard and gotten dirty in the process. Drex took the rag, looking down at his ruined clothes and his bleeding palms. For the first time, the dirty feeling wasn't coming from his sins, but from a sacrifice. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He was a man standing in the light, covered in the evidence of his own humanity. The sun dipped low, painting the scaffolding in hues of bruised purple and gold as Drex sat on a crate in the foyer, his hands still stinging from the day's labor. He pulled the leather-bound ledger toward him, the book that had served as his roadmap through a landscape of his own sins. With a hand that still trembled slightly from the weight of the falling steel, he took a heavy black marker and drew a thick, unwavering line through the final balance. The $50 million, the stolen millions that had fueled his rage for 2 years, ceased to be a debt. "It's settled," Drex rasped as Tressa approached, her shadow lengthening across the dusty floorboards. He shoved the book toward her, not with the aggression of a creditor, but with the finality of a man closing a grave. Tressa looked at the marked-out figures, then back at the man covered in the grime of her sanctuary. For the first time, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes softened into something resembling a fragile peace. "You're letting it go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening wind whistling through the unfinished eaves. "I'm not letting it go, Tressa," Drex corrected, standing up and feeling every ache in his humanized frame. "I'm acknowledging that it was never mine to begin with. It was blood money. It belongs to the ghosts." But even as the words left his lips, the cold, hard reality of his world surged back in. He looked toward the iron gates, knowing that while he had burned the ledger in his heart, the Hanel organization did not deal in forgiveness. Marco and the others wouldn't see an act of grace. They would see a sovereign who had grown weak, a boss who had traded $50 million for a paint-smudged apron and a child's gratitude. The shadow he had turned away earlier that day was merely the first ripple of a coming storm. By forgiving Tressa, he had placed a target not just on her back, but on the entire colonial house. The organization would come for the money, and they would come for the man who had failed to collect it. Drex looked at Knox, who was curled up asleep on a pile of drop cloths, and realized that the hardest part of building this foundation wasn't the masonry. It was the fact that he would now have to burn his old world down to keep this one standing. The blue hour of dawn brought a silence that felt like a held breath until the distant synchronized crunch of boots on gravel broke the peace of the colonial estate. Drex stood on the porch, his shadow long and jagged across the white-painted floorboards. He was no longer the pristine boss in a tailored suit. He was a man in a torn shirt, his knuckles raw and his heart tethered to the house behind him. He didn't have his usual security detail, only the cold steel in his waistband and the fierce, silent vow he had made to the woman and the child sleeping inside. The iron gates he had once walked through with such arrogance were now the boundary between his past and his penance. As the first wave of Hanel enforcers emerged from the morning mist, led by a stone-faced Marco, Drex didn't reach for his weapon to defend his throne. He thought of the stick figure drawings taped to the foyer walls, the messy, colorful crayon lines that depicted a world where he wasn't a monster. "You're making a mistake, Drex," Marco's voice carried through the crisp air, devoid of the respect it once held. "You're throwing away a legacy for a pile of wood and a few orphans." "I'm choosing a legacy," Drex countered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The attack was sudden and surgical. Glass shattered as the organization's cleaners tried to breach the side windows, but Drex moved with a desperate, localized fury he had never known. He wasn't fighting for territory or millions. He was fighting for the sanctity of a breakfast table and the scent of wet primer. He intercepted a man at the threshold, the struggle spilling into the foyer. As they crashed against the scaffolding, Drex's eyes caught a drawing Knox had made, a picture of a fancy man holding a paintbrush. With a roar of protective rage, Drex disarmed the intruder, his movements fueled by the realization that if these walls fell, the only light he had ever known would go out with them. He wasn't the sovereign of shadows anymore. He was the guardian of the colonial house. Bullets chewed into the plaster he had spent all day smoothing, and white dust filled the air like a ghostly fog. Amidst the chaos, Drex saw Tressa standing at the top of the stairs, her arms wrapped around Knox, her eyes wide with terror, but her spirit unbroken. He realized then that he wasn't just defending a building, he was defending the only people who had ever looked at his under-construction heart and seen something worth saving. He turned back to the gates, his jaw set, ready to be the shield that the children of his victims finally deserved. The scars of the battle remained etched into the colonial pillars, but they were now filled with wood putty and sanded smooth, hidden beneath a final, triumphant coat of white paint. The scaffolding had been struck down weeks ago, leaving the estate to glow in the afternoon sun like a beacon of unearned grace. The smell of wet primer had finally given way to the scent of fresh grass and the bubbling aroma of a home-cooked meal drifting from the kitchen. Drex stood in the foyer, no longer the man in the tailored black suit who had arrived with a heart of steel. He wore a simple, faded shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hands, once instruments of fear, now calloused from the honest labor of building a sanctuary. He looked at the walls, where the stick-figure drawings were no longer just taped up, but proudly displayed in wooden frames he had built himself. Tressa emerged from the hallway, looking radiant yet weary, the tan apron still tied around her waist. She was no longer the loyal maid who had fled in the night, and she was no longer the traitor he had hunted. She was the architect of a new life. She stopped beside him, her hand naturally finding his. The touch was no longer electric with the tension of their past, but grounded in the quiet covenant of their present. "The last of the winter blankets arrived," she said, her melodious voice now a constant anchor in his world. Drex nodded, his gaze shifting to the yard where Knox Alder was leading a group of children in a game of tag. The boy who had asked if Drex's heart was under construction now looked at him with a total, uncomplicated trust. Drex was no longer a boss commanding an empire of shadows. He was a provider, a protector, and a parent to the children of the very men he had once destroyed. He had sacrificed his power and his name to become a servant leader in a house built on his own blood money. As Knox let out a peal of laughter and ran toward them, Drex realized that by losing his life as a monster, he had finally found one worth living. The stolen millions were gone, but as he stood there with Tressa and the children, he knew he had never been wealthier. The foundation was finally set, not in stone or currency, but in the enduring legacy of grace.